No one denies that the environment is important. But the price that we pay for the environment should not be the lives of the people in the developing world. We see in the status quo that South America and Africa combined only contributes to less than 10% of global emissions worldwide. The effect that they could have in overall pollution and effect on global warming is negligible. But what about the consequences, ladies and gentlemen? We say it's quite the opposite. We see that by not prioritizing economic development, it destroys economies, it bankrupts lives, and it ruins responsibility. Essentially, what side propositions are here to tell you is that we must never rule out the right to survive, ladies and gentlemen. Essentially, we think that in terms of the definition and our policy, that the developed nations have to bear the brunt of the responsibility in terms of carbon emissions. Because A, they're the people that brought it about, and B, they can make the greatest impact to changing environmental damage in the world. But we're not giving developing nations a blanket solution, the rights to pollute. We are not granting developing countries a leeway to destroy the environment. We encourage active participation in helping out with global progress if necessary, if they can afford to do so, as in the case of China. And we expect them to commit themselves more fully to the progress of protecting the environment if they become developed nations. But we refuse to ask them to sacrifice their bread and butter and potentially their lives in order to resort to a futile solution that is simply not going to save the environment, as we told you, because they contribute to very little to global damage. Yes, sir.
At the height of Chinese development, a new coal-fired plant was being built every 3 days.
About China, they're taking proactive steps in order to create the economy. And even though they do not have the right to destroy the environment, they're taking proactive steps to do so. For example, China is building 3 times more nuclear power plants than the rest of the world combined this decade. This shows that when nations have the right to pollute, that they will take proactive steps to do so, and the status quo doesn't necessarily need to stand. What our policy means in practice, ladies and gentlemen, means that the international community will not put a cap on developing nations' pollution. In international accords such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accords, seeing that their economic prosperity needs to be prioritized.
Yes,
no, thank you, sir. The critical question that proposition asks you in this debate is whether we should force ineffective environmental stewardship when people starve to death for it. And in answering that question, proposition gives you 3 substantive points. Number 1. As a Prime Minister, I'm going to tell you how overburdening developing countries destroys essential economic development. Secondly, I'm going to tell you how it continues neo-colonialism and dependence. Whereas Jiwon will step up to the podium after me and talk about how it perpetuates irresponsibility. Now let's move on to our first substantive point, how it destroys essential economic development. In my preamble, I already told you how countries in the developing world, such as Zimbabwe, with a 95% unemployment rate, and India, with slums in which thousands of people die because of inadequate state resources, simply needs to be addressed before we can talk about environmental preservation. No thank you, sir. What we see is that global warming has no worry for people who will die miserably before the cycle of environmental damage even begins, ladies and gentlemen.
Sir.
Yes, sir.
And yet, a lot of those countries, the death and famine that is created in a lot of those countries is caused by global warming, such as what we saw in Sudan.
And that is precisely caused by the developed countries, ladies and gentlemen, who need to pay the consequences for such damages. You are not simply addressing the issue that developing countries and the cutback in global emissions from their countries will simply not address the issue. Now, we see that even if we deny developing countries the right to pollute, what happens is that in the status quo, we see a failing system. They refuse to sign on to accords such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accords simply and precisely because of the fact they do not recognize the international community's right to refuse them this right. We say that they simply cannot stand up here and propose a practical solution to deny developing countries these rights, because this is a right that they will fundamentally and individually assume without the interference from the international community. Now, additionally, we say that enforcing this right too quickly will result in even greater environmental damage, as we see in the example of the Three Gorges Dam in China. In order to appease the international community's demands to create more renewable energy sources, China created the Three Gorges Dam. And what this resulted in is because they didn't have the necessary infrastructure to deal with the environmental consequences. 2 million people were displaced. 200,000 species were eradicated. And additionally, 4 countries in Southeast Asia had their fishing and agricultural industries wiped out as a result of the Mekong River being blocked by the Three Gorges Dam. This is environmental and economic desecration in the greatest degree that happens when we compel developing nations to take action when they're simply not ready for it. And we say that it destroys the environment, it destroys livelihoods, and it destroys the economy, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's move on to our second substantive point about how denying countries the right continues neocolonialism and it perpetuates dependence. Now, forcing developing countries to take action when they don't have the ability will create neocolonialism and further dependence on resources from developed countries. This is exactly what happens in Iran, in which even though Iran produces large amounts of raw petroleum, has to be sent to other countries in the developed world, such as France and my country, South Korea, in order to process this fuel. This fuel is then sold back to Iran, handing huge amounts of profit in misplaced hands, such as France and other developed countries. And then what happens is that developing countries are cheated out, ladies and gentlemen. Now, additionally, what this results in is that because of the fact that multinational corporations will find it now easier to exploit the resources within developing countries because of the fact that developing countries will not have resources to develop the infrastructure for renewable sources themselves, would in fact invite multinational corporations into their countries. What happens in these specific circumstances are very clear. So what happened in Nigeria when they invited Royal Dutch Shell into their borders is very clear. The Niger River was destroyed because the Nigerian government hadn't erected necessary environmental regulations to deal with this kind of invitation. What happened as a result was that the river was destroyed. The Nigerian economy depends 90% of its economy on agriculture, and all of this was destroyed. People had to starve, and then what happened was that the multinational corporation invited thugs and brutes in order to beat the people who protested this kind of environmental desecration. As I told you very clearly in the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, refusing to the right for developing nations to survive will only result in massive costs, both in terms of the economy and the environment. At the same time, it's going to create a negligible effect on how, in terms of the environment, can actually be protected. At the end of the day, the critical question is still clear. Should we pay so much costs in order to protect so little? And the answer the side proposition is going to give you is quite clear. And that answer was no. Thank you very much.